All right, I would like to welcome everyone here to the Schiller Institute Forum in Ottawa. I know that some of you have attended some of the events that we've done over the last, I would say, 2 years. So you probably, some of you are familiar with our lead speaker, Michael Billington, who is the Asia Desk editor for the Executive Intelligence Review. He's also one of the principal authors of a report you'll be hearing more about, entitled "The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge." I see some people have already picked this up. As what is going to be gone through here today by Mike Billington and the other speakers are the kind of considerations that have to be taken into account if we're going to emerge from a situation which is quite dangerous. You sort of look at what's happening around the world in terms of the shooting down of this Russian airplane, the terrorist incident that occurred recently in Paris, the danger that the entire international financial system is on the verge of coming down. And what Mike Billington is going to go through with you both in terms of how to understand this as a coherent process, and that there is an alternative process of development in motion. So Mike Billington is going to go into that. Then we have Benjamin Deniston, who is a member of Lyndon LaRouche's science research team. He is one of the principal authors of another special report that you can get a copy of here. It's entitled "Global Warming Scare is Population Reduction, Not Science." Now, I know that some people might think that that's a shocking title, but I think what we want to do in this forum is, this is not three, thirdly, we have a third speaker that I will mention in a moment. This is not three separate addresses. It's a unified conception of what the nature of the world is and how we move towards a situation which is, we're able to create a future state of the world situation. So he's going to discuss this and the kind of conception of man that is necessary to get the world out of this kind of crisis. And then thirdly, I'd say that we're very honored to have with us today a distinguished university professor from the University of Ottawa, Dr. Jan Weiser, who's done groundbreaking research in the area of earth sciences, that, and also what is not unusual, has had the courage to not only break the frontiers in terms of science, but also to go against what he calls the zeitgeist in terms of what's you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. And he's going to be speaking tonight about why carbon dioxide is not a driver of the climate. So, and then our second speaker, Ben Deniston, will give more of an introduction of Dr. Weiser after his presentation. So with that, I will turn the event over to our first speaker, Michael Billington.
Thank you, Bob, and I'm very pleased to have the chance to speak to in Canada once again, and particularly honored to be speaking with Dr. Weiser, one of the preeminent scientists in Canada and the world, really, on this area. I must start by saying I'm going to be far more blunt than I had planned to be because of the developments yesterday. The shooting down of this plane was an act of war. It was an act of war which has put the world on the brink of a thermonuclear confrontation, an extremely dangerous situation. I want to start by reading the brief statement that Mr. LaRouche put out yesterday concerning this incident. He said, "Obama organized an act of war. Lyndon LaRouche today responded to the Turkish shoot-down of a Russian fighter plane by declaring that, quote, Obama organized an act of war and has thus endangered the United States as well as all of humanity. Qualified American figures have emphasized in the immediate wake of the Turkish actions that Turkey's President Erdogan would never tacit support from Obama. Those sources observed that Obama was furious over the weekend that the French government, under tremendous popular pressure, was moving towards a real alliance with Russia to destroy ISIS. In stark contrast to that same sane French response to the Paris attacks of November 13th, Obama has renewed his demands that the ouster of Syrian President Bashar Assad must happen immediately and must precede the actions against the Islamic State. LaRouche called for Obama's immediate removal from office. Quote, Obama's actions constitute a potential act of war, and he must be kicked out of office. Otherwise, making any further excuses for Obama in light of the events of today poses a threat to all of the world because it could lead to general war. LaRouche added that the, quote, prospect of impeachment is hanging in the air. This crisis has changed the world irreversibly. It began really with the mass refugee crisis sweeping over Europe, which began to wake up the European leaders and the European population, which by and large had been in lockstep with Obama's policy of regime change. The unilateral decision that those governments which are not pleasing to our president can be overthrown without any congressional approval, which is required by our Constitution, without support from the United Nations, which is required by international law, and of course without the support of the nation, which is targeted for regime change. What happened in Europe was that the flood of refugees, people so terrorized by the ISIS barbarism that they were willing to risk their lives in rubber dinghies crossing the Mediterranean in small boats, forced the Europeans to recognize that this is not only a disastrous policy, but it can no longer be considered something over there, that it was coming home to roost. And then this was followed by the breaking out of terrorist acts from the Syria-Iraq theater with the takedown of the Russian airplane, the Beirut bombing, and then, of course, this barbaric French attack, which certainly convinced most of Europe that they could no longer follow the regime change policy, that they had to work with the Russians, that the sanctions against Russia had been self-defeating for the Europeans, but when it came to strategy, it was clear that what Putin had done by intervening in Syria had demonstrated that the Obama administration was effectively on the side of the terrorists. We know, for instance, that our own Defense Intelligence Agency chief, General Michael Flynn, who worked very closely with the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, General Dempsey, for years. In 2013, at the time that Obama was planning to invade Syria around the chemical weapons issue, General Flynn advised the president, through General Dempsey, that to do so would effectively be on the side of terrorism. It would be on the side of al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Levant, which is now known as ISIS, and that it would lead to the creation of an extreme radical caliphate movement in both Iraq and Syria. Exactly what has happened. When General Flynn, a few months ago, decided to go public with the fact that he had informed the president of this fact, the journalist interviewing him said, "Do you mean that President Obama inadvertently was supporting the terrorists?" And General Flynn said, "No, this is not inadvertent. This was the intended policy to ally with the terrorist forces in order to achieve the regime change against the secular governments, first in Libya and now in Syria, as, of course, George Bush and Dick Cheney did in Iraq before them. And, in fact, as was done in Ukraine, when the U.S. proudly supported a coup against an elected government, despite the fact that the forces leading the coup were carrying the swastika, were openly supporters of Stefan Bandera, Adolf Hitler's collaborator in Ukraine during World War II, and that this crisis is continuing today. What Putin has done in exposing that fact by showing that you can, in fact, defeat ISIS by collaborating with the legitimate government, legally in Syria because invited by the legitimate government, has demonstrated, and in collaboration, by the way, with all the nations, or all the immediate nations in the region, Egypt, Jordan, Iran, and so forth, that this situation can be dealt with by approaching it with the intent of actually defeating this terrorist force and not the illegal imperial policy of regime change followed by President Obama. I will add that there is a growing fight in the United States to release the chapter of the congressional investigation into the 9/11 report, a 28-page section on funding of the pilots and others who carried out the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. That 28 pages was classified by Bush and Cheney. And although President Obama promised that he would lift that classification to when he was running for president, he then reneged on that and has kept that chapter classified. We know from its authors that that 28 pages documents the fact that the Saudi regime, Prince Bandar, who was then the ambassador to the United States, and later became the intelligence chief of the Saudis, and even the current King Salman, who at the time was the head of one of the charities that was funneling money to the pilots who carried out that terrorist attack on the United States. So we have the President of the United States supporting terrorists to overthrow secular governments and openly allied with the country which has been the primary funder and armor of these terrorist movements, the Salafist, Wahhabi movements across the Middle East. This is the ugly reality that we're looking at today. And with this abomination yesterday, the shooting down of a plane that clearly was no threat to Turkey, was an intentional act, premeditated, as Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov said today. And where it's heading, we're not sure, but it is a situation where it's not going to end unless, in fact, we can move to impeach President Obama immediately. So that's the introduction of the desperate situation the world finds itself in today. What I want to address is, first of all, the cause of this war danger, and secondly, that the solution is in hand. It's in front of us today, and what that solution can and must be. The reason I want to address the cause is that it's not Ukraine, it's not Syria, it's not the South China Sea in terms of the confrontation with China. Those are predicates, but the cause of this war, extreme war danger, is best seen in this picture. Go ahead to the second slide. You around? Mm-hmm. Second slide? Yeah, the BRICS. This, as I'm sure you all know, is the BRICS alliance that's been formed between Russia, China, and India, with Brazil and South America representing, in fact, most of Africa and most of South America, collaborating with the three key nations of Eurasia, Russia, China, and India, centered around China's extraordinary transformation over these last 30 years, where they have lifted 600 million people out of poverty, built one of the most powerful productive nations in the world, advanced into space exploration, where the U.S. is effectively getting out of space exploration, building nuclear power plants, and now moving into the developing world with the same approach to building true nations through scientific and technological development. What the Western world sees there is the Western banking system sees there is a tremendous threat. What the City of London banks and the Wall Street banks, who are in a state of absolute economic bankruptcy, a bankruptcy far, far beyond what happened in 2007 and 2008. And I'll mention here that the crisis of 2007 and 8, which was forecast by Mr. LaRouche very clearly, was the direct result of the takedown of the policies of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, and especially his most important bill called the Glass-Steagall bill. If you're not familiar with that, briefly, what Roosevelt did when he came to power, he recognized that fascism in Europe was coming to America through the banking system. On his first day in office, he shut down the entire banking system, what he called a banking holiday. And those banks were allowed to open only if they could demonstrate that they had taken the speculative junk, the gambling debts, off of their books. And if they could, they were allowed to open up. And then President Roosevelt began extending credit using the American system of economics developed by Alexander Hamilton to extend federal credits through the banking system with very clear strings attached. That the money could only be used to lend out to industry, agriculture, schools, hospitals, scientific development, infrastructure. And the Glass-Steagall Act separated the commercial banks from the investment banks. And the commercial bankers were not allowed to speculate. They were not allowed to buy stocks and bonds or insurance or derivatives. But they got government guarantees in case they got in trouble. Their depositors were safe. The investment bankers were allowed to gamble with rich people's money. They were not allowed to take regular deposits. But if they got in trouble, they got no government support. That was what was taken down in the 1990s, which led to the wild speculation of the Bush-Cheney years and continuing through the Obama years. When Obama came in, he said he was going to rein in Wall Street. Well, he did quite the opposite. He passed a bill called Dodd-Frank, which made sure there would be no limit on the merging of the investment in commercial banks, no limit on the use of depositors' money and others for the wild speculative binge in derivatives, which are basically just gambling debts, to the point that now the US and European banking system has more than twice as much of the bad gambling debts on their books. Approximately $2 quadrillion, that's 1,000 trillion. This is the financial breakdown that we're sitting on today, which could blow up literally at any moment, provoked by oil prices, provoked by other things. When the bankers look at the BRICS, they say they're trying to take away our power to loot the third world. We have had access to basically free or close to free raw materials, same as the colonial era did, and in exchange for nothing, practically. We were able to dominate these economies, impose austerity conditions on them, and take their raw materials in return. And this is seen as a very, very serious threat to the banks, that the BRICS nations are now saying there's another paradigm, there's another game, there's another way we can develop the world. Ironically, it's based on what used to be well known as the American system under Alexander Hamilton. Part of this, as you know, is the proposal by Xi Jinping for the new Silk Road economic belt and the new maritime Silk Road. I want to go through a little bit of the history of this because our organization has been directly involved in this process since the 1980s. When the Soviet Union fell, Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche proposed that this was a moment where we had the chance to end not only the Cold War, but to end war once and for all, to bring the world's nations together around the common aims of mankind. Rather than geopolitics, the idea me against him, one against all, to locate the fact that the common aims of mankind were based on the need for regional development and infrastructure that uplifted the platform of all nations and made it possible to actually bring people together for peace through development. We made that proposal to the Europeans, we made it to the Russians, we made it to the Chinese. The Europeans rejected it absolutely. They were more interested in looting Russia, as they did throughout the 1990s. And they were more interested in moving their NATO forces up to the Russian border, which they did, which brought us to the disaster that we're in today. The Russians were very open to the idea, some of them, but the country was being ripped apart, looted, by the Yeltsin government's turning the situation over to the oligarchs trained by Maggie Thatcher, who came in and stole everything that they could get out of the country until Mr. Putin came in at the end of the century. The Chinese, on the other hand, were very optimistic, accepted the idea totally. Mrs. LaRouche co-sponsored with the Chinese government a huge conference in Beijing in 1996. The Chinese called it the New Eurasian Land Bridge, rather than our term, the New Silk Road. Show that map. This is the map that we published at that time in 1996. You'll see the three routes of the Eurasian Land Bridge. The northern route, which was basically rebuilding the old Siberian Railroad. The central route through Central Asia into Europe. And the southern route going through Southeast Asia into India, and then into the Middle East and down through Africa. The late 90s, we saw, as I'm sure you remember, the so-called Asian crisis when George Soros and the hedge funds looted the currencies of Asia, practically destroying Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and others. But it also, the Chinese had to hold back on the kind of development they wanted to do at that time, so things got stalled. But nonetheless, they did build the central route. There is now a train running from China to Germany through Central Asia. It's not a high-speed rail, and it also has the severe problems of different grade tracks, so you have to change from one train to another several times. That can be resolved. But then we had, when Xi Jinping came in, he went to Kazakhstan and announced the new Silk Road. He went to Indonesia and announced the new Maritime Silk Road. And this idea was reborn. Mrs. LaRouche has been back to China at least a half a dozen times over the last 2 years. I joined her on one of those trips, meeting with government officials, think tank officials. She's known in China as the Silk Road Lady. They're quite open about the fact that it was she and her husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who inspired the idea of the other, but as development corridors, which would develop the underdeveloped Central Asia region, help develop the Russian Far East, and exchange science, exchange technology, exchange culture. This idea as the basis for long-term peace to end the Cold War and the threat of hot war. What we did at that time is, meaning just over the last year and a half, is that we said, this is great, this is wonderful, this is what's needed, this is what we've been fighting. But we said we need to go further, and you can go to the next slide. We developed the report that I think you've seen there. The new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge. And I encourage you to get a copy of that before you leave if you don't have it already. It's a 370-page program for the development of the entire world, the entire solar system. It includes the proposals for a global Glass-Steagall approach, meaning that we direct credit in a way that in a certain sense China and other countries do already, that we return to that policy in the U.S. by passing a Glass-Steagall bill. But it then takes on Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even the U.S. and Canada on the kinds of developments that are desperately needed. As I'm sure you know, the U.S. and Canada have a horrendous infrastructure deficit. So this is not just for the third world, this is for the world, to build the kind of infrastructure development that, again, makes it possible to bring nations together. One of the key projects, for instance, is to build a tunnel under the Bering Strait, connecting Alaska to Siberia, or to the Russian Far East. This was a proposal that Vladimir Putin strongly supported and sponsored a conference in in Moscow, in 2006, at which Mr. LaRouche was a keynote speaker. Putin called a war avoidance policy. By building the infrastructure connections between the United States and Russia, we could begin to break down those who advocate confrontation and war. That was the idea. So our approach to this was to develop the entire world and to make clear that you could only succeed in this process if, in fact, we brought the entire world together. Otherwise, we would end up with continuing conflict and war. I want to show you one map from that report. That's the Africa map. I think this report, or these two maps of Africa, I think demonstrate the difference between the era of Western colonialism and what's taking place now under the direction of the BRICS, and especially China. You see the map on the left, that's the existing railroad in Africa today. The railroad's largely built by the colonial powers. And I'm sure you see that they all go from the port to the mine, and that's all. You can't get from one capital to another. You can't get across the continent by rail. And that was the intention. The intention was to keep the countries backwards by not having the infrastructure needed to work as regions and to develop the vast resources of the region for their own development, not just for Europe's development or the United States. Now you look on the other side, and that is what's now being planned. Li Keqiang went to Africa last year, and he said, we will build high-speed rail connections connecting every capital in Africa. Some of this is already proceeding. They're building 2 or 3 cross-continental rail connections. In other words, China needs raw materials just like the Western powers did. But the difference is they're paying for it. They're not paying for it by loading up debt. They're paying for it by building nations, by building nuclear power plants in South Africa, by building water projects across the region, by building high-speed rail connections. I'll mention, by the way, that the other atrocious terrorist attack this last week in Mali, which killed 17 people and injured over 100, it may not have been noticed by many that 3 of those killed were 3 top China railroad construction company officials. 2 international managing directors and the managing director for East Africa. I believe that was intentional. I think that was part of the decision to attack that particular hotel. The Chinese last year signed a very aggressive contract to build new rails, high-speed rail between Mali and Guinea and Senegal to develop a new iron ore deposit and a steel mill. That's the target of the British Empire, the American, Anglo-American cabal, who are in fact behind the Saudi-financed and run terrorist operations. You can turn that map off now. So let's look at what happened in Asia just this last week. We had in Manila the APEC meeting, and then in Kuala Lumpur you had the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Summit. Mr. Obama was there. President Obama basically lectured them on human rights, tried to organize a declaration of aggression against China, having to do with their building up some of the islands under their control, building some lighthouses and some airstrips. This was called an act of aggression. This was called the militarization of the South China Sea. Now, none of those events included anything like that in their final communique. The ASEAN nations, with the exception of the Philippines, totally rejected that false construct. They recognized that China is, in fact, the center of their hope for a new world based on development, based on railroads, based on infrastructure, based on industry. Whereas the United States is bringing the pivot, which is moving 60% of their military forces into Asia. They are trying to force Korea to accept high-altitude missiles called THAAD missiles, which the Koreans do not want. They don't need it against North Korea, which is only 30 miles away. And they know that these high-altitude missiles are only intended as part of their ring around China and Russia for Obama's confrontation and war policy towards those nations. But most importantly, the U.S. is trying to recolonize, I call it, remilitarize the Philippines. They have signed an agreement with a subservient president in the Philippines who had agreed that despite the fact that the Philippine Constitution forbids absolutely foreign military bases on its soil, and has since the early 90s. Nonetheless, Obama and President Aquino came to an agreement that they would deploy massive advanced U.S. air, sea, and land power into the Philippines, into 8 or more bases in the Philippines, under the subterfuge of saying that they will be built within Philippine military bases, that they're only guests, that these are not really military bases. This process includes, by the way, 2 advanced military bases in the South China Sea, on Palawan Island, part of the Philippines that juts out into the South China Sea. And yet, Obama accuses China of militarizing the South China Sea because of some lighthouses and some airstrips. The rest of ASEAN recognizes this. They refuse to have any such communiques in their final documents, and for good reason. At the same time, economically, Obama is trying to isolate China through his Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a deal which basically sacrifices the sovereignty of those nations who sign on to it, but whose main intent is to isolate China. They're bringing in their green fascism policy, which says the world is burning up through carbon, and therefore the developing nations have to give up their idea of development because otherwise they're going to burn up the world. I don't have to address that because Dr. Weiser and Ben Denison will address that in full when I'm finished here. But keep in mind that the architect of this global warming hoax, Prince Philip, Prince Bernard, Martin Palmer, Prince Philip's religious advisor, Mr. Schellenhuber, the architect of this, and unfortunately the architect of the Pope's recent encyclical, which succumbed to this satanic view that we have to limit the world's development. These people believe and state repeatedly that the world cannot sustain more than 1 billion people. They cannot sustain more than 1 billion people. So which 6 million do you suppose they think should be eliminated through nuclear war or other means? So that's the situation we have. There are 2 paradigms in the world. One is based on the idea that the human being, born in the image of God, or as the vicegerent of God, as you have in as the unity with heaven, as you have in the Confucian tradition, that man is defined by his creativity. He's defined by the fact that he can know the future and create the future, unlike any animal. And that paradigm, which is now being championed by the BRICS nations, and which has a chance of being restored in the United States and Europe, if we can succeed in our effort to bring these European and American population to recognize that we can and we must join with the BRICS. We must restore the historic American policy of nation building, building ourselves and building the world, which we haven't really seen since the time of Roosevelt, although John Kennedy tried to do the same thing and was murdered for that reason. To do that, we're going to have to change the United States drastically. We have to identify the fact that the drone killings, the fact that our president takes great joy in every week getting together with his security advisors and drawing up a kill list for the week. No due process, no recourse for those charged with being terrorists. Recently, the drone papers were released by the same Glenn Greenwald who released the Snowden documents exposing the vast criminal operations of our National Security Agency. Those drone papers reports confirm what we've documented for years, which is that the president literally takes great joy in this killing process. It confirms that only about 10 or 20% of those killed are even on the list. The rest are the children and the wives of those who we've decided to eliminate without due process, as our Constitution demands. that perhaps activities that look like terrorism, like shooting in the air, justify hitting them with a drone, which is why we've had 3 or 4 wedding parties destroyed because people were shooting in the air. This is the kind of criminal activity that's being carried out by the U.S. government under President Obama. We're going to have to restore the Glass-Steagall bill. I can tell you that we have bills before the House and the Senate, and as a result of our efforts, usually alone for years, that Glass-Steagall fight is now the center of the U.S. presidential campaign. Hillary Clinton, who compromised herself by working for Obama against our advice, is now on the side of war, on the side of Wall Street. But this is being exposed, and the other Democratic candidates are in fact fighting to restore Glass-Steagall, which would bankrupt the major too-big-to-fail banks on Wall Street, but it would save the commercial banking system in America and around the world. So this is what we have to achieve in America, and we need the support of nations around the world, backing the BRICS process and backing our efforts here in the United States and Canada and in Europe to bring back this tradition from the Christian Renaissance, the European Renaissance. If we're going to succeed now, we have to pull out from every great culture the best of that culture. We have to pull out from the Chinese culture the great Confucian tradition, and especially that of the Sung dynasty Renaissance in the 12th century under Jushi, which in fact was very under people like Nicholas of Cusa. In fact, the Baghdad Caliphate, the Islamic Renaissance of the 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th century period, which was in touch with China at that time through the old Silk Road, these represent the moments of greatness in these cultures, which can and must be brought together now to have a global Renaissance, one based truly on the best of mankind, the creative power of mankind, as a species capable of building the entire world and thinking beyond this physical world to the universe as a whole, as Ben will address as well. I'll end with that, but I'll return to what I said at the beginning, is that there has to be an end to geopolitics. Geopolitics is the old British imperial idea that in order to gain for one's nation, you must do it at the expense of other nations. This led to the imperial concept. It can be ended. It's what Xi Jinping calls the win-win approach. It's the Renaissance idea of a common aim to mankind, a common identity of man as a creative species. This is what's in our hands today, but we're at a moment where there's only those two choices. The two paradigms are before us. The one is there to choose, but the one which is now dominating and leading us to war still is in power, but is threatened. And we have the capacity to bring about a dramatic and revolutionary change, a Renaissance change in the world over these coming weeks and months, perhaps the most crucial moment that we've had in human history. So I'll leave it at that. And Bob, I think you were suggesting that we take some discussion first.
Yeah, we can take about 30 minutes of discussion.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I was going to have to be very blunt, but this is not internal to the United States. We have a president who is satanic. I use that word clinically. He truly loves to kill. He has now carried out criminal invasions of two countries. Criminal invasions. What was done to Libya was intentional. He allied with terrorist organizations at a time when we're supposedly in a war with terror. The Ansar al-Sharia and other organizations in Libya, which we knew, the UN knew, to be linked to Al-Qaeda. We chose to back them and to arm them. We chose to deploy them against the stable secular regime of Gaddafi, who, like Saddam Hussein before him, was using the oil money largely to develop his country, far more developed than other nations in the Middle East, and using those resources to help African countries across the continent. That's why he was considered an enemy. When he was personally murdered before the world, snuffed in a video, as I'm sure you unfortunately had to watch, as all of us did, Mr. LaRouche immediately said, the British Empire and their stooge Obama are preparing for war on Russia. And this has been borne out with a vengeance, to the point where yesterday we saw the first NATO attack on a Russian plane since the Korean War. For no reason, only as a provocation, premeditated. And as Mr. LaRouche said in the statement, and our close intelligence friends, including some of the people I made reference to, at the head of our intelligence agency. I should mention that General Michael Flynn, who was the head of our Defense Intelligence Agency, was fired by Obama after the incident I described in 2013, when he warned Obama that attacking Syria the way he was would lead to this kind of a caliphate. And by the way, we just learned last week that Obama's Defense Secretary, Chuck Hagel, also warned the president that we could not defeat ISIS unless we worked with the Assad government, the elected government of Syria, and we collaborated with the Russians. And he was fired. Secretary of Defense. And in his place, Ash Carter, who has been a mouthpiece for the British and for Obama. The ugly reality is that this is an extremely dangerous, evil personage in our presidency, controlled by Wall Street, controlled by the British financial institutions, both in London and Wall Street, who is committed to salvaging a bankrupt financial empire by any means necessary, by destroying the BRICS so that they continue the looting of the third world, by imposing this green genocide policy which says you may not develop. In fact, this morning I read that Chatham House, one of the leading institutions of the British Empire, released a report showing that if we don't stop meat consumption, that it's going to cause global warming because of cow flatulence. And therefore we have to convince the developing nations where if they proceed to create a new middle class eating meat at the rate of Europeans and Americans, it will burn up the world. President Obama went to South Africa 2 years ago and told a college group that if you aspire to have 2 cars and air conditioning, the world will burn up. Imagine telling aspiring African educated people that they can't have air conditioning. I use these as anecdotes, but the point is we're on the brink of world war. Those around Obama and the banking institutions who think you can force Putin to back down, I think they now know, or anybody sane now knows, they will not back down. They're not going to watch the destruction of humanity. If it means they have to go to war, they are prepared to go to war. And therefore, we have to stop the cause of that war, which is the bankruptcy of the Western financial system and those who are imposing that policy. So there's much that can be done, of course. Putin's doing a great deal. Xi Jinping has been doing a great deal. Narendra Modi in India is doing similar things, and it all being done in collaboration. These are all extremely important. But your question, the answer is yes. We have to remove this president. We can't wait for the next election, by the way. I'm sure you've seen what we have on the Republican side. Lunatics, in many cases, who've never seen a war they didn't love, who want to force Muslims to wear yellow armbands. I'm exaggerating. They want them to carry identity cards, but remember what Hitler did with the Jews, with the yellow armbands. I think it's the same mentality. So this has to be an immediate move in the coming weeks and months to act on the vastly documented crimes of this president. Mr. Putin, by the way, has shown the way. If you follow his speeches, and I encourage you to get our daily alert service, which is also available, Putin has repeatedly told the truth about what's being done in the West, about the truth that the West purposely dropped out of the anti-ballistic missile system and started building ballistic missiles along the Russian border in Europe and Asia, claiming this was against Iran. Well, now Iran's not a threat, but they're saying, well, we have to keep them there anyway. And the Russians know this is aimed at Russia. The official U.S. military doctrine is called prompt global strike. In Asia, it's called air-sea power. Both are first strike policies with the insane idea that we can take out the enemy's nuclear capacity to strike back. This is insane. If we start a world war, civilization will probably not survive. And that's what we have to act on now. Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
I could probably talk for hours, but I'll try to be very concise. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher and the Saudi regime signed an agreement called Al-Yamama. Al-Yamama was a deal where the British sent their warplanes to Saudi Arabia in exchange for 1 tanker of oil a day, perpetually, which was not put into the pot back in the UK, but was put into a special fund, sold on the spot market, and used to create a global resistance to the Russians. In Prince Bandar's autobiography, written by, it's an official biography, I should call it. I forget the name of the British fellow who wrote the book. But in that book, he brags about the fact that the money from the Al-Yamama deal was used to gather up Islamic radicals in prisons across the Middle East and in Asia, in Indonesia and elsewhere, and train them train them basically as terrorists, and sending them to Afghanistan in order to fight the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. This is the root of the Mujahideen at that point. When the war ended, these people went back to their homes in the southern Philippines and Mindanao and Indonesia. Most of them were from Saudi Arabia. This then began to proliferate as various organizations, most of which had their official headquarters in London, what we sometimes call Londonistan, where they are allowed to be openly proselytized, openly organized, and effectively created these multiple offshoots of the Al-Qaeda movement that were used against, as I said before, the secular governments in the region who had maintained the peace by being able to use their resources to sustain both Sunni and Shia populations in their country, as was true under Saddam Hussein in Iraq, as was true under Gaddafi, and is true under Assad. Until we began to see this massive funding and the creation of these Mujahideen and ultimately Al-Qaeda forces under bin Laden, who, as I'm sure you know, his family is the leading, one of the leading families in Saudi Arabia, very close to the Bush family. The bin Laden family, not Osama bin Laden, but his family, were in Texas with George Bush on 9/11/2001. When all the planes in the United States were grounded, one plane was allowed to leave. That was to take the Saudi bin Laden family and their crew out of the country. So this was the root. Now, how ISIL came about, as opposed to al-Nusra Al-Qaeda in the Iraq and Levant and so forth, was what I described before. We knew this existed. We knew this was the most extreme form of the Wahhabi sect out of Saudi Arabia, even willing to attack Saudi Arabia itself. But that this was brought about because of the fact that Obama, as General Michael Flynn has publicly identified, chose to back these Islamists in order to overthrow these secular regimes. And Assad, unlike Gaddafi and unlike Saddam Hussein, had the support of the Russians, who had learned their lesson in Libya. You may remember that Obama went to the United Nations and got a vote for a no-fly zone in Libya to protect what he called the people in Benghazi, which was this nascent terrorist movement. And the Chinese and the Russians were bamboozled. They were told this was only going to be a free no-fly zone, and they abstained at the Security Council. And of course, it was far more than a no-fly zone. It was a complete all-out bombardment, destruction back into the Stone Age for all of Libya and the murder of their leader. And now you see what it is. It's warring terrorist factions. The country is a complete basket case. It's leading to the refugees and so forth. So I can just say that basically you have differences amongst these terrorist organizations, but by and large, the ISIL and the ISIS, or the IS, is the culmination of that force being used primarily to destroy any remnants of secular governments in either Iraq or Syria, and as you see, functioning as an international terrorist force to terrorize the West into giving in to some sort of a full-scale war policy, primarily aimed at Russia. And keep in mind that most of the leadership of ISIS is Chechnyan. They're Russians. Mr. Putin has made very, very clear that there are at least 3,000 to 4,000 Chechnyans and others from the Balkans in the leadership of ISIS who will come back to Russia if they're not destroyed there. And of course, the same is true for other countries as well. I certainly don't know what they're going to do in the Mali case, but China's in a difficult position on this. China's very aware of the fact that they now have global interests, very, very broad global interests. I mean, they're involved in major, major construction programs across Africa, across Latin America. I didn't mention it, but the Chinese are also building 2 transcontinental railroads in South America. They are carrying out these global development projects without a global army to protect it. And they don't want a global army or navy to protect it. They don't want to become a new colonial power, a new imperial power. They want to work with the West to end this imperial idea once and for all. Now that's a tall order, of course. Some people say, oh, that's pie in the sky. It's not possible. It is possible. And we're at a moment in history in which the danger is so great that it's relatively easier now, at a moment of tremendous crisis, to get nations and peoples to agree that we have to begin working together as human beings. Like I said, in the tradition of our great Renaissance moments that exist in all of these cultures. I know the Chinese had one of their people executed by IS the other day, too. You might have seen. I don't know if he was beheaded, but they killed a Dane and a Chinese he was just a Chinese guy traveling who got captured. The head of Al-Qaeda put out a video about 2 years ago now calling for global jihad against China, saying that they oppress the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province. And the Chinese have handled the terrorist threat amongst the Uyghurs very carefully They knew they were being trained in Pakistan as part of the terrorist institutions there, and coming back. And then when the El-Libi, at that point, put out this video calling for the jihad on China, they had to take more serious measures. But they're in a difficult position, as I said. They don't want to send military forces in to protect their development projects. They want to bring the West together with them in a way that will not require the militarization, that we can defeat this terrorist force through collaboration, through the approach that Putin has taken to collaborate with the governments of the region to truly wipe this out. So I can't tell you exactly, but I know the Chinese are not going to back down from these tremendous development projects that they're launching across the world. This is the point of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the new development bank, the SCO Development Bank, the $40 billion new Silk Road, entire new financial institutions, which again, they're not challenging the IMF and the World Bank to replace them, but they're quite open in saying the problem with the IMF and the World Bank is that they no longer build infrastructure, with very few exceptions. They simply said, no, we're going to leave infrastructure to the private sector. Well, that means there won't be any infrastructure, because private sector interests are looking for profits in a relatively short period of time. Infrastructure doesn't return profits in a short period of time. It has a 30 to 50-year span. That's why governments have to be responsible for infrastructure, as America was under the Hamiltonian system and under Roosevelt. The government is responsible for those things that private sector cannot do over the long term, but like water, like power, like education, like health, so that the private sector entrepreneur has power, has water, has a skilled workforce, a healthy workforce, has transportation, and therefore it lifts the entire platform of the nation as a whole and regions as a whole. But this is what the IMF and the World Bank gave up on under, unfortunately, British and American influence. And therefore, the Chinese have developed new financial institutions because they now have the wealth to do it with. And like I said before, this is seen as the enemy to the New York and London banks. This has to be stopped. This is what's behind this war drive. It's not the local incidents. You can't look at these things as local phenomena. This is a global battle over the question of whether the world will be governed by development and progress, or if it's going to be governed by an imperial banking financial dictatorship. And it's going to be decided in the very, very near term, one way or the other.